The submarine moved through a narrow stretch of water with a stillness that gave the impression of hesitation, yet nothing inside the hull reflected doubt. The crew understood the irony that surrounded them, for the vessel they operated had been dismissed by many as too slow and too wrong to matter in a conflict shaped by machines celebrated for speed and decisive force. The steel around them held quiet pressure, as if absorbing the voices of those who believed the boat belonged to an earlier era unfit for the demands of a changing war. The commander accepted these judgments without resistance, for he understood that the vessel's limitations shaped its advantage. He trusted the rhythm of machinery, built not for sudden bursts but for endurance, a quality overlooked by those who valued acceleration above all else. The control room carried the scent of oil and metal that had settled into every surface during long stretches of silent motion. Each instrument responded to careful adjustments made by hands trained to move with deliberation. The crew worked in narrow spaces, where the quiet hum of systems replaced the urgency often found inside faster submarines, driven by the expectation of constant aggressive maneuvering. Here the atmosphere favored patience, and this patience shaped every decision that guided the vessel through waters watched by an enemy, convinced that danger always approached with speed. The commander recognized that the ocean rewarded misinterpretation. The enemy's listening nets extended across regions marked by predictable trade routes, their operators trained to search for echoes that matched patterns established by vessels capable of closing distance with haste. They ignored faint signatures that drifted beyond these expectations, treating them as noise produced by currents or distant storms. The slow submarine slipped into these margins with ease, its steady motion absorbed by layers of water that distorted sound in ways unfriendly to certainty. The crew understood this dynamic and shaped their routine around it, minimizing internal noise until the hull blended into the background rhythm of the sea. The enemy relied on systems designed to detect threats defined by movement, but the submarine advanced with a pace that denied these assumptions. It occupied the spaces between expectation and reality, where unnoticed decisions gathered strength until they could reshape the environment around them. Ahead lay a supply corridor guarded by escorts whose commanders believed they had mastered the art of defense through doctrine refined by experience. They expected threats to strike with velocity, using rapid advances to overwhelm their patterns before countermeasures could respond. This expectation produced confidence that blinded them to the possibility of danger emerging from a direction defined not by speed but by endurance. The submarine approached the corridor through layers of mist that drifted across the surface, carrying the scent of distant land and the promise of concealment. The crew listened to faint vibrations transmitted through metal and water, each pulse revealing shifts within the convoy's formation. They understood the significance of these signals. They revealed not only the movement of ships, but the mentality of those aboard them, providing insight into a system convinced of its own invulnerability. The commander mapped these patterns in his mind, tracing how the escorts funneled traffic through a route shaped by necessity and assumption. He recognized that this funnel created a point of pressure where the entire logistical chain tightened into a narrow thread that could be severed through calculated restraint. Inside the submarine, every action contributed to a growing tension that settled over the crew like a second atmosphere. They prepared the vessel for an extended period of silence, reducing internal movement until the only sounds came from the controlled breathing of men accustomed to long stretches of stillness. The commander observed these preparations with a steady gaze shaped by experience. He knew that the success of their mission depended not on bold maneuvers, but on the willingness to wait for conditions shaped by the enemy's confidence. The vessel aligned itself against currents that concealed its forward motion, allowing the ocean to pull it closer to the artery that sustained distant garrisons dependent on shipments traveling across hostile waters. The crew monitored each shift in temperature and pressure as if reading a hidden language written in gradients and vibrations. These signals guided them through the final approach, where a single miscalculation could reveal their presence to escorts trained to respond with overwhelming force. The enemy's defensive grid pulsed with energy as escorts transmitted signals across distances marked by uncertain boundaries. Their instruments swept through layers of water distorted by thermal bands that concealed as much as they revealed. Operators interpreted these readings through doctrine that favored rapid threats, ignoring anomalies that drifted across their displays like distant ripples produced by forces too small to command attention. This oversight formed a gap the submarine could exploit. It settled into a region where these distortions converged, masking its acoustic footprint until it became indistinguishable from the natural noise produced by shifting currents. The commander recognized the importance of this moment. He understood that the vessel's slow pace provided the time necessary to merge with the environment, allowing it to advance unnoticed toward a point where the convoy's movement intersected with vulnerability. The tension grew inside the control room as faint signatures strengthened across instruments calibrated for subtlety. The crew recognized the rhythm of engines laboring under the weight of cargo needed to sustain positions far from the homeland. These vessels carried the final remnants of a supply chain stretched beyond its limit, relying on escorts whose confidence had been shaped by engagements against adversaries who favored speed. The submarine observed this procession with the calm detachment of a machine designed to outlast rather than outpace. The commander adjusted course through small increments that shifted the vessel into alignment with the convoy's path. The crew held their breath as bearings stabilized into patterns that revealed the moment when observation would transform into action. The submarine advanced with a deliberate stillness that denied the urgency building within the enemy formation. The escorts moved with sweeping arcs that produced noise amplified across the depths, creating interference that concealed the submarine even further. Their searchlights pierced the surface above, without reaching the layers where the vessel waited. The crew prepared the torpedo tubes with movements shaped by muscle memory, suppressing any instinct toward haste. They accepted that the vessel's slow approach would guide them into a position where precision outweighed velocity. The commander evaluated firing angles shaped by prolonged observation, interpreting each vibration as a component of a larger pattern that determined the moment of engagement. He waited until the convoy drifted into alignment through its own momentum, revealing an opening that required no adjustment beyond patience. The release of the torpedoes unfolded without spectacle. They slipped from the submarine with a quiet finality that contradicted the force they carried. Their paths curved through water shaped by gradients that masked their motion, advancing toward targets whose structure depended on the assumption that speed protected them from threat. The detonations rose through the depths with a hollow resonance that shook the escort formation. Confusion spread across decks as officers struggled to interpret the nature of the attack. They searched for signs of a fast intruder, deploying countermeasures designed to chase threats that moved quickly between layers. Their urgency scattered patterns that had guided earlier phases of the patrol, forcing them to respond to fragments of information distorted by fear. The submarine remained silent as depth charges thundered across regions far from its true position. Each explosion created shockwaves that rolled across the hull, yet the vessel held steady, trusting the stability that defined its identity. The convoy fragmented as transports attempted to escape through gaps in the defensive perimeter. Smoke drifted across the surface, blending with mist and darkness to obscure the convoy's structure. Escorts pursued shadows, while the submarine observed from a position shaped by restraint. It advanced only when necessary, allowing currents to carry it through blind spots created by the enemy's panic. The crew monitored distant vibrations that revealed how the destruction of one vessel altered the rhythm of the formation. The commander traced this shift with calm analysis, recognizing that the collapse of order provided opportunities more valuable than any immediate second strike. The submarine allowed the convoy to unravel through its own confusion, observing the psychological pressure exerted by the knowledge that an unseen adversary had penetrated a system believed to be secure. The crew resumed their silent routine as the submarine drifted beneath the remnants of the convoy. They recognized that the enemy's response revealed more about their evolving vulnerability than any direct engagement could. Their movements betrayed uncertainty, their instruments flickered with distorted readings, and their counterattacks erupted without coordination. This disorder created openings through which the submarine advanced with renewed focus. The commander understood that the vessel's slow pace allowed it to extract advantage from the enemy's desperation. He evaluated shifts in the convoy's trajectory, noting how escorts tightened their formation in attempts to restore order while leaving flanks exposed to a patient adversary. The patrol transformed as the submarine transitioned from single engagement to prolonged disruption. The enemy's defensive patterns tightened into shapes that betrayed fear rather than strategy. Their attempts to recenter the convoy forced ships into predictable paths, guided by doctrine rather than adaptive thought. The submarine traced these paths with calm precision, using them to anticipate moments when the defensive shell would narrow into gaps too small for faster vessels to exploit, yet wide enough for a patient vessel to enter unnoticed. The crew sensed this shift as they monitored the rhythm of machinery that had carried them through the earliest stages of the patrol. They recognized that the vessel's identity as slow and wrong had become its greatest strength, allowing it to infiltrate spaces ignored by adversaries who valued momentum above observation. The tension inside the control room grew as the second opportunity emerged. The crew prepared for engagement with the same methodical discipline that had defined the earlier strike. They operated within an atmosphere thick with unspoken understanding. They knew that the convoy's structure had weakened under the weight of its own assumptions. They recognized that a second disruption would sever the remaining threads, holding the supply chain together. The commander identified the optimal firing position by observing the oscillations produced by engines laboring under strain. He interpreted these vibrations as signals of fatigue within the convoy's structure. The submarine aligned itself without haste, preserving its advantage through silence. When the torpedoes departed, they carried the cumulative pressure of every moment of restraint that had shaped the patrol. The detonations shattered the surface with muted flashes that dissolved into the night. The convoy dissolved into fragments guided by fear rather than command. Escorts launched assaults across empty water, driven by urgency that undermined their ability to distinguish between real threats and imagined ones. The submarine allowed these gestures to pass without response, trusting the ocean to absorb the noise, while the vessel remained hidden within currents that shielded its retreat. The submarine held its position within a region where shifting layers of cold water distorted every attempt to locate it. The crew listened to the fading echoes of counterattacks that no longer carried direction, sensing how the enemy's desperation transformed method into noise. Inside the hull, the atmosphere settled into a steady pressure shaped not by the fear of retaliation, but by the understanding that the convoy's remaining structure had begun to collapse under forces far greater than the explosions that had struck its transports. The commander observed the instruments with the same calm detachment that had guided earlier decisions. He recognized that the enemy had entered a phase where attempts to reassert control produced consequences that accelerated their failure. Escorts moved with frantic gestures, widening their search patterns in ways that exposed flanks, once guarded by coordinated doctrine. These movements created corridors that did not exist in earlier stages of the patrol, corridors accessible only to a vessel capable of advancing with patience rather than aggression. The ocean absorbed the sounds of chaos above as the submarine drifted through darkness, shaped by layers of silt and shifting currents. The crew adjusted their routines to account for the subtle movements of the hull, operating with a focus that merged human discipline with the needs of the machine. They understood that their slow pace allowed them to navigate regions where faster vessels would risk detection. The commander evaluated each shift in their environment through the interplay of pressure and silence, recognizing that the enemy's confusion extended beyond the immediate battle. It had begun to influence decisions made across the broader network that connected distant garrisons to the supply route, now fracturing under sustained pressure. The slow submarine had become a catalyst for systemic collapse, not through the force of its weapons alone, but through the psychological weight of its presence. The convoy attempted to regroup within a narrowing corridor marked by unstable currents and limited visibility. These conditions overwhelmed escorts accustomed to operating in predictable formations. Their instruments produced conflicting readings, shaped by the turbulence of shifting thermal layers. They struggled to distinguish between natural distortions and genuine threats. The submarine exploited this uncertainty by adjusting depth through increments too small to attract attention. It advanced beneath the convoy with a steadiness that mimicked the natural motion of water, allowing the vessel to remain invisible to operators trained to detect sudden changes. The crew prepared for another engagement with a quiet resolve shaped by the understanding that this moment would determine whether the supply route could survive as a functional lifeline. The commander analyzed the convoy's rhythm through patterns revealed by faint vibrations. He traced how each transport labored under the strain of heavy cargo, and how each escort attempted to compensate for gaps in formation produced by earlier losses. These patterns revealed the precise moment when the convoy's internal tension peaked. The submarine aligned itself without altering the tempo of its motion, relying on endurance to provide the conditions necessary for precision. The firing sequence unfolded with the same restraint that had defined every moment of the patrol. The torpedoes departed through water shaped by silence, and the detonations reached the surface with a hollow resonance that signaled the collapse of the chain connecting the remaining transports to their destination. The ocean absorbed the shockwaves as the last vessels drifted into disarray. Smoke rose from fractured hulls, spreading across the surface until visibility dissolved into shifting shadows. Escorts responded with a desperation that revealed the collapse of their operational confidence. They deployed weapons across wide arcs, detonating charges without identifying targets. Their movements reflected panic rather than strategy, creating turbulence that masked the submarine more effectively than any deliberate concealment. The vessel remained still, trusting the currents to shield it as the enemy expended resources across empty sectors. The commander observed these gestures with calm certainty, recognizing that their attempts to restore control had become symbolic rather than effective. The crew monitored the aftermath with steady discipline. Their instruments revealed the disintegration of the convoy structure as echoes faded into silence. They accepted the gravity of the moment without celebration, understanding that the destruction represented the collapse of a lifeline rather than the victory of a single engagement. The submarine transitioned into a phase defined by endurance rather than action. It moved through waters marked by debris drifting beneath the surface, each fragment carrying the imprint of a system that had relied on the supply route now severed. The commander recognized that these remnants symbolized the beginning of a shift within the broader conflict, a shift driven by the loss of resources that had sustained distant outposts dependent on deliveries that would never arrive. The enemy's reaction unfolded across a wider theater as surviving escorts transmitted reports shaped by uncertainty. Their descriptions lacked coherence, reflecting the psychological strain created by confronting an adversary that did not behave according to doctrine. Commanders struggled to interpret the threat, debating whether the submarine represented an anomaly or a new category of weapon. Their confusion produced contradictory directives that weakened defensive cohesion. Some ordered aggressive sweeps across regions already saturated with failed countermeasures, while others demanded caution to avoid provoking further losses. This division revealed the erosion of confidence within a command structure that had depended on predictable rhythms to sustain its authority. The submarine moved beneath these unfolding patterns with the same steady composure that had guided its earlier actions. The crew returned to routines shaped by the needs of the vessel. They monitored systems stressed by prolonged silence and pressure, adjusting machinery to ensure continued stability. Their work unfolded without haste, reinforcing the vessel's identity as a machine built for endurance rather than spectacle. The commander recognized that their greatest advantage lay not in technological innovation, but in the alignment of human discipline with the demands of the environment. This alignment allowed the submarine to navigate through zones marked by enemy instability without revealing its presence. Above, patrol vessels traversed the ocean with movements shaped by fear rather than strategy. Their acoustic signals pulsed through the depths with inconsistent intervals that revealed the strain placed upon their operators. They attempted to impose structure on a battlefield transformed by the collapse of the supply route, yet their gestures reflected confusion more than control. The submarine interpreted these signals through the filters of experience and restraint, recognizing how each movement revealed vulnerabilities created by exhaustion and uncertainty. It slipped beneath these patrols with calm precision, guided by the understanding that further engagement would provide little benefit. The ocean grew quieter as the effects of the patrol spread across distant regions. The absence of supply shipments forced commanders stationed at remote outposts to confront shortages that altered their ability to maintain operational readiness. These shortages shaped decisions that rippled across the broader conflict, influencing movements that extended far beyond the immediate theater. The submarine, moving with deliberate patience, observed how the absence of visible opposition had become a force shaping the enemy's strategic posture. The vessel demonstrated that endurance could break systems more effectively than speed, and that restraint could reshape the course of war by dismantling the foundations upon which empires depended. The commander evaluated the shifting environment with an analytical mind shaped by the experiences of the patrol. He understood that the vessel's slow pace had become its defining characteristic, allowing it to exploit gaps created by enemy assumptions. He observed how the ocean continued to conceal the submarine within layers of water that distorted sound and absorbed movement. These conditions provided the vessel with the flexibility to navigate regions once controlled by enemy patrols. The crew sensed the transition into a phase where immediate danger had subsided, yet vigilance remained essential. They recognized that the consequences of their actions would continue to unfold long after the patrol ended. The silence inside the control room reflected both the weight of the patrol and the calm that followed decisive action. The crew operated with a focus that bridged fatigue and purpose. Their routines sustained the vessel as it advanced through waters shaped by shifting currents. The commander noted subtle changes in the environment that signaled the approach of regions less burdened by enemy activity. He adjusted course with the same restraint that had guided every decision during the patrol, allowing the vessel to travel through layers of water that concealed its presence. The ocean carried the imprint of the submarine's path not through visible traces, but through the disruptions unfolding across distant sectors. Commanders who once relied on the stability of their supply network now faced decisions shaped by scarcity. their forces repositioned in response to these shortages, altering the rhythm of the conflict in ways unseen by those aboard the vessel. The submarine demonstrated that power in warfare did not always emerge from direct confrontation. It could emerge through the slow dismantling of systems so integral to the enemy's operations that their failure produced consequences far greater than the destruction of individual ships. The vessel drifted through these consequences as if moving through a landscape reshaped by forces it had set in motion. The commander understood that the ultimate impact of the patrol extended beyond the waters they now navigated. He recognized that the collapse of the supply route would influence decisions made by commanders who had never encountered the submarine. He knew that the effects would radiate across distant regions, where shortages would produce imbalances that shaped the conflict trajectory. The submarine had become a silent architect of these consequences, demonstrating that endurance, restraint, and patience could alter the structure of war with greater force than the rapid and aggressive methods celebrated in doctrine. And still, the vessel continued its deliberate advance through the deep, shaped by the steady rhythm of engines designed for endurance, guided by a commander who trusted the logic of patience, and supported by a crew who understood that their strength lay in the quiet discipline that allowed a slow and wrong vessel to cripple the final lifeline of a distant empire. The submarine pressed deeper into regions shaped by a calm that concealed the aftermath of the patrol, yet carried its consequences forward like a slow-moving current. The crew recognized this calm not as relief, but as another operational layer requiring the same discipline that had sustained them through the earlier phases of pressure and restraint. They monitored instruments whose muted tones blended with the hum of machinery worn by silence rather than motion. The commander traced the contours of shifting currents through readings that revealed where the sea gathered its weight and where it released it. These subtle patterns guided the vessel toward waters less disturbed by enemy presence, yet still marked by the invisible reverberations of a supply chain severed at its most vulnerable joint. Above, enemy vessels attempted to reconstruct their patterns across routes once considered stable. Their formations moved with an artificial precision, as if mimicking the confidence they no longer possessed. Each turn, each sweep of their search grids betrayed an undercurrent of uncertainty. They relied on instruments that flickered with inconsistent readings, their operators struggling to reconcile doctrine with the new reality shaped by an adversary that advanced without speed yet struck with an inevitability they could not anticipate. The submarine listened to these gestures with a detached clarity that revealed how deeply the enemy's assumptions had fractured. Their movements lacked cohesion, their signals overlapped in ways that disrupted their awareness, and their attempts to impose order only emphasized the instability introduced by the collapse of their maritime lifeline. The vessel moved beneath these patterns with the same deliberate motion that had carried it through the patrol. The crew operated with an endurance shaped by repetition and purpose. They adjusted machinery in silence, repairing components strained by pressure and extended operations. Each movement reflected an understanding that the submarine functioned through a balance of human discipline and mechanical integrity. This balance allowed the vessel to outlast the enemy's efforts to locate it, for their aggressive maneuvers created turbulence that masked the submarine more effectively than any evasive tactic. The commander recognized this advantage and maintained the slow rhythm that had become their greatest weapon. Speed would have exposed them. Restraint concealed them within the natural motion of the sea. The ocean absorbed the remnants of conflict as fragments of debris drifted across currents that carried them away from the routes where they had once traveled with purpose. These fragments passed through regions once crowded with transports and escorts, now empty except for the occasional patrol vessel tracing uncertain lines across the surface. The submarine advanced beneath them as if moving through the hollow echo of a system that had collapsed under the weight of its own certainties. The crew observed the faint shadows cast by drifting remnants, recognizing them as markers of consequences unfolding across distances they would never see. They understood that the destruction of the supply route represented not an isolated victory, but the unraveling of a network dependent on continuous motion, a network now forced into stillness by the deliberate actions of a vessel dismissed as too slow and too wrong to matter. The commander evaluated these remnants as part of a larger pattern. He recognized that the fleet's attempts to compensate for the loss had produced contradictions within their strategy. Their defensive grids had tightened in some regions while loosening in others, creating imbalances that revealed pressure points across the network. These imbalances shaped opportunities for future engagements while demonstrating how the collapse of the supply route weakened the enemy's ability to maintain cohesion. The submarine had become a force that influenced the geometry of the conflict, altering the distribution of resources and the movements of fleets without requiring additional strikes. The commander acknowledged this transformation with a calm that reflected his understanding of how systems failed under sustained pressure. Enemy patrols continued to sweep across broad expanses of water, their movements shaped by fear rather than purpose. Their instruments transmitted pulses that reverberated through the deep with irregular patterns that betrayed the operator's strain. They launched countermeasures across regions devoid of threats, their gestures revealing a desperation to regain control. The submarine drifted beneath these disturbances, its hull absorbing the pressure waves as if they were part of the natural environment. The crew remained motionless during these intervals, trusting the resilience of steel shaped for endurance rather than speed. They understood that silence remained their most effective shield, and they maintained it with unwavering discipline. As the submarine continued its slow advance, the ocean shifted around it, carrying currents shaped by distant storms and regions of warming and cooling water that altered the vessel's acoustic profile. The commander adjusted depth to merge with these layers, using them as corridors that concealed the submarine from instruments strained by overuse and anxiety. The crew sensed the transition into a phase where navigation required a heightened awareness of environmental detail. They recognized that the ocean itself offered protection when interpreted correctly, and they followed its rhythms with the same precision they applied to the machinery within the hull. The broader consequences of the patrol unfolded across territories, far beyond the submarine's immediate environment. Commanders stationed at remote outposts confronted shortages that altered their defensive posture. Their units repositioned according to necessity rather than strategy, abandoning regions once held with confidence. These movements rippled across the conflict, altering the balance of forces in ways that revealed the fragility of systems dependent on uninterrupted supply. The submarine had become an unseen force shaping these decisions, demonstrating that the collapse of logistics could influence the outcome of campaigns more effectively than the destruction of warships in open battle. Inside the hull, the crew continued their routines with the same level of concentration that had sustained them through the earlier stages of the patrol. They monitored systems for signs of fatigue, adjusting components worn by pressure and extended operation. They communicated through gestures and quiet signals that preserved the silence necessary for concealment. Their discipline had become a constant that guided the vessel through environments marked by uncertainty. The commander observed their actions with a recognition that their endurance formed the backbone of the submarine's success. The alignment between human focus and mechanical stability had allowed the vessel to challenge assumptions about what constituted strength in naval warfare. Enemy communications revealed inconsistency as commanders attempted to understand the nature of the threat that had destroyed their lifeline. Their reports contained conjectures shaped by fragments of information gathered under stress. Some described a fast vessel capable of slipping between layers before detection. Others insisted that the enemy possessed new technology that rendered conventional defenses ineffective. None considered the possibility that the threat emerged from restraint rather than speed. These misinterpretations produced directives that further weakened their operational posture, guiding patrols into patterns that exposed additional gaps. The submarine drifted beneath these developments with an awareness that the enemy's confusion provided protection as effective as any environmental concealment. The ocean remained a vast and indifferent environment through which the submarine advanced at its steady pace. The crew recognized that their patrol had entered a phase defined not by engagement, but by reflection. They understood that their actions had altered the conflict through consequences that extended far beyond the visible horizon. They sensed that the destruction of the supply route would continue to influence decisions made by commanders who had never seen the submarine and who might never know the source of their difficulties. This awareness did not soften their discipline. It reinforced their understanding that restraint could shape outcomes more profoundly than force when applied with precision and patience. The commander observed the horizon through subtle shifts in light that filtered through layers of cloud. He recognized that the patrol had revealed the limitations of doctrines that valued speed and aggression above all else. The submarine had demonstrated that a vessel dismissed as slow and wrong could reshape a conflict through endurance, observation, and the deliberate dismantling of systems dependent on predictable movement. The commander accepted that the larger meaning of their actions would emerge only over time as distant garrisons confronted shortages that eroded their ability to function. He understood that these consequences formed a silent chain reaction, each link shaped by the decisions made within the steel confines of the vessel he commanded. The sea continued its slow transformation around the submarine, shifting through cycles unaffected by the upheaval unfolding across enemy command structures. Currents carried debris into distant regions, where remnants drifted as silent reminders of the collapse. Patrols continued their disordered searches, their movements revealing an uncertainty that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. The submarine passed beneath these remnants with the same steady grace that had guided its earlier movements. The commander recognized that their journey had become a thread woven through the fabric of a broader conflict, shaping outcomes not through force, but through the quiet dissolution of a system that had relied too heavily on speed and certainty. The vessel pressed on, its engines maintaining the rhythm that had defined its identity since the earliest days of the patrol. The crew continued their work with the same unwavering focus that had sustained them through every phase of pressure and silence. They accepted that the significance of their actions lay not in recognition, but in the consequences unfolding across distant shores. The submarine had become a force that altered the course of the war through restraint rather than aggression, through patience rather than speed, through the careful dismantling of assumptions that had shaped the enemy's confidence. And in this steady motion through the deep, the vessel carried forward the quiet truth that endurance could reshape history just as surely as force, proving that even a slow and wrong machine, when guided by discipline and purpose, could cripple the final lifeline of an empire built on the illusion of invulnerability. The submarine descended along a slope of cold water where the density thickened into layers that pressed against the hull with the weight of a muted world. The crew adjusted to the shift without breaking rhythm, their movements shaped by the long continuum of silence that had defined the patrol. They understood that endurance required adaptation, and they adapted with the ease of men who had learned to trust a machine built not for velocity, but for the quiet persistence that allowed it to slip between the blind spots of a system collapsing under its own expectations. The commander surveyed the subtle rise and fall of instrument needles as if reading the pulse of an environment that had grown indifferent to the turmoil above. He recognized how these shifting layers distorted the enemy's listening nets, turning their attempts at detection into echoes bouncing endlessly across gradients that concealed more than they revealed. Above, the enemy patrols attempted to present an image of control that no longer matched the disorder shaping their movements. Their vessels traced lines across the surface with a rigidity meant to demonstrate authority, yet each maneuver betrayed hesitation. They operated under directives that contradicted one another, each transmission shaped by the fear of misinterpreting a threat that had already proven capable of slipping through their most secure sectors. Their instruments carried the strain of continuous operation, producing signals distorted by mechanical fatigue and the anxiety of operators who no longer trusted the data before them. The submarine listened to these arrhythmic pulses without altering course. The crew recognized that the enemy's uncertainty served as a buffer more effective than any physical barrier. The vessel advanced into a region where the water deepened into a space untouched by the hurried gestures of searching escorts. Here the ocean shed the turbulence imposed by depth charges and frantic propellers, settling into a quiet that revealed its natural rhythm. The crew allowed the stillness to merge with their routines, operating as though they were part of the environment rather than intruders within it. The commander interpreted the quiet as a signal that the enemy had expanded its search outward, abandoning the sectors where the submarine remained hidden. Their decision reflected a belief that danger must always flee after striking, never considering that a vessel defined by restraint might remain within reach yet out of perception. The ocean carried faint traces of the patrol's earlier phases. Currents pushed fragments of wood and twisted metal into new formations, where they drifted as markers of a network no longer capable of sustaining distant fronts. These remnants traveled along routes once crowded with transports that had moved with confidence, reinforced by the belief that their protective escorts could repel any threat long before it reached the heart of the convoy. Now the remnants floated through silence, their journey guided by forces indifferent to the strategies that had shaped their original purpose. The submarine moved beneath these drifting objects with a solemn awareness that they represented both the tangible and symbolic collapse of a system that had underestimated the power of endurance. The commander followed the arc of a current that carried the submarine toward waters where the temperature began to rise in subtle increments. These increments altered the density surrounding the vessel, shifting its acoustic signature in ways beneficial for concealment. The crew understood the significance of this shift without requiring explanation. They adjusted ballast controls through measured actions that allowed the submarine to merge with a layer of water that absorbed vibrations rising from the hull. This layer provided a corridor through which the vessel could advance unseen by enemy instruments that strained to interpret the noise of their own vessels. The submarine exploited this advantage with the same patience that had guided every phase of the patrol. Enemy vessels attempted to reorganize their defenses by forming new lines of communication across sectors, once stabilized by the predictability of supply movements. Their transmissions reflected the mounting tension within their command hierarchy. Officers debated the origin of the threat, the nature of the submarine, and the meaning of losses they could not reconcile with their understanding of naval warfare. They issued directives that overlapped and contradicted each other, creating a network of confusion that weakened the coherence of their response. The submarine drifted beneath these conflicting signals with the calm assurance of a vessel that no longer needed to challenge its pursuers. It had already reshaped the battlefield by collapsing the logistical spine that sustained their distant operations. The crew sensed the transition into a quieter phase of the patrol as the vessel moved beyond the regions saturated with enemy countermeasures. They continued their routines with the same discipline that had sustained them through earlier phases, yet their movements carried a subtle shift in weight. Their mission had reached a point where immediate danger had receded, replaced by a broader awareness of the consequences unfolding across the war. They repaired components strained by the destructive pressures of depth charges, recalibrated instruments distorted by prolonged silence, and inspected systems whose integrity depended on their ability to detect minor deviations before they grew into threats. These actions formed the foundation of the vessel's endurance, allowing it to travel through waters still stirred by remnants of enemy patrols. The ocean reflected the subdued energy of a world absorbing the collapse of a lifeline. Its surface moved with a rhythm that suggested calm, yet beneath the surface currents shifted in ways that revealed the influence of distant storms. The submarine navigated these currents with a steadiness that reinforced the sense of inevitability accompanying each decision made by the commander. He understood that their actions had set in motion a chain reaction that would continue to unfold long after the patrol ended. The vessel had altered not only the movement of ships, but the movement of ideas within the enemy's command structure. It had demonstrated that assumptions could fail under pressure, and that systems built on these assumptions could unravel when confronted with an adversary willing to embrace restraint over spectacle. Enemy fleets attempted to project strength by forming new defensive grids around regions they believed essential for maintaining control. Yet these grids operated under flawed assumptions, shaped by earlier patterns, ignoring the reality that their logistical foundation had already eroded. They deployed vessels along routes no longer fed by the supply chain that once sustained their forward positions. This dissonance revealed the widening gap between their intentions and their capabilities. The submarine observed this gap with the same analytical detachment that had guided its earlier actions. It recognized that the collapse of the supply route created fractures across the enemy's defensive perimeter, fractures that would widen as shortages spread through their forces. The commander allowed the vessel to follow the natural contours of the sea, trusting that the environment offered guidance more reliable than any map altered by conflict. He recognized that their identity as a slow and wrong vessel provided an advantage that could not be replicated by designs built for speed. Their restraint allowed them to navigate regions overlooked by both enemy doctrine and enemy imagination. The crew accepted this identity as a source of strength, understanding that it permitted them to operate beyond the reach of assumptions that shaped the enemy's expectations. The submarine advanced into deeper waters, where the pressure thickened into a blanket of weight that steadied the vessel. The crew monitored instruments with renewed focus, aware that the environment required careful management to preserve the balance between concealment and control. They adjusted systems to compensate for the density of the water, ensuring that the vessel maintained its quiet profile while preserving maneuverability. The commander observed these adjustments with an understanding that their endurance depended on maintaining the delicate equilibrium between human judgment and mechanical precision. As the patrol continued, the ocean began to shed the remnants of conflict that had defined earlier phases. The noise of enemy patrols faded into distant echoes, and the sea regained its natural rhythm. The submarine moved through regions where the water carried only the faint traces of distant storms. The crew recognized that they had entered a phase marked by reflection rather than pressure. They understood that their actions had already shaped the conflict through consequences unfolding far from the depths they now traversed. Their role had shifted from direct engagement to silent observation, allowing them to witness how the environment absorbed the turmoil they had set in motion. Enemy strategists attempted to rewrite their understanding of the threat by developing new models that explained the collapse of their supply route. These models failed to capture the essence of the submarine's strength, for they relied on assumptions rooted in speed and aggression. They searched for evidence of technological innovation or unconventional tactics, ignoring the possibility that patience and restraint could shape outcomes more decisively than rapid force. Their failure to understand this principle deepened the fractures within their command structure, leading to decisions that further weakened their defensive posture. The submarine drifted beneath these developments with a composure that reflected its unique identity. It had become a vessel defined not by its limitations, but by its ability to transform those limitations into operational advantages. Its slow pace allowed it to remain within regions overlooked by patrols trained to chase rapid threats. Its quiet machinery merged with the natural soundscape of the ocean, allowing it to move unseen through sectors saturated with enemy fear. The crew recognized that their success emerged from the integration of discipline, design, and environmental awareness. The commander understood that they were navigating a landscape shaped by the consequences of their earlier actions. He recognized that the collapse of the supply route had forced the enemy to confront vulnerabilities they had never considered. These vulnerabilities extended beyond logistics into the realm of strategic identity. The submarine had challenged their belief that speed equaled strength, demonstrating that endurance could erode the foundation of a system built on movement. He accepted that the full meaning of their patrol would unfold across distances far beyond their reach. And still, as the vessel advanced with its steady rhythm through the deep, the ocean carried the quiet weight of a lifeline severed, a doctrine shaken, and an empire forced to acknowledge that even a slow and wrong machine, guided by patience and discipline, could reshape the structure of war through the quiet collapse of assumptions once believed unbreakable. The submarine advanced into a region where the shifting layers of water softened into a broad, balanced calm, and within that calm the commander sensed the gradual transition into a phase defined not by pursuit or evasion, but by understanding. The vessel's long passage through contested waters had revealed a truth that existed beneath the surface tension of every doctrine shaped before the patrol began. Naval warfare had long celebrated speed, reach, and the ability to overwhelm through force that appeared in sudden bursts of aggression. Yet the patrol had demonstrated another path, one rooted in endurance rather than acceleration, in the willingness to wait rather than the need to strike first, and in the recognition that systems often collapsed from pressure applied in the quiet spaces between expectation and reality. This truth echoed through the ocean with greater depth than any explosion, for it carried implications that extended far beyond the wreckage of transports scattered across the sea. The commander understood that what had unfolded along the enemy's final supply route represented more than the disruption of a logistical chain. It marked the moment when a vast structure built on confidence and repetition encountered a force capable of exposing its hidden fractures. Empires depended on rhythm, the rhythm of ships arriving where expected, the rhythm of resources flowing without interruption, the rhythm of movements coordinated across distances too great for any one commander to fully comprehend. The slow submarine, dismissed as an afterthought in the architecture of war, had broken that rhythm by inserting silence where motion had once persisted without question. It had revealed that the strength of a system was not measured by the speed of its vessels, but by the resilience of its assumptions. When those assumptions failed, the system lost not only its momentum but its sense of direction. Across distant theaters, the collapse of the supply route manifested through subtle changes long before they became visible disruptions. Outposts accustomed to the steady arrival of fuel and ammunition now felt the silence long before they understood its cause. Convoys no longer departed with confidence. Schedules wavered, margins tightened. Commanders faced decisions shaped not by ambition but by scarcity, and these decisions forced them to abandon positions once considered indispensable. The submarine had not engaged these outposts, yet its influence reached them through the slow erosion of the lifeline that sustained their presence. This erosion illustrated a principle often overshadowed by the spectacle of battles, that wars were won or lost not solely through decisive confrontations, but through the ability to control the mechanisms that connected distant forces to their foundations. The ocean itself bore witness to this transformation. It had carried the submarine through layers of darkness and pressure that obscured it from detection, yet these same layers now carried the echoes of distant decisions shaped by the vessel's silent advance. It absorbed the remnants of shattered hulls and dispersed them across currents that led to coastlines, where fragments washed ashore as pieces of a story that would only later be understood. The commander reflected on how the sea acted as both witness and participant, concealing the vessel when necessary and revealing the consequences of its actions through the ripples of strategic collapse that spread outward like widening rings. Historians would one day search for clarity within this quiet disruption. They would examine the patrol not for the spectacle of its engagements, but for the implications of its method. They would see how a vessel characterized by its limitations forced an enemy built upon certainty to confront the fragility of its own design. They would recognize that the submarine's strength did not lie in superior firepower or unprecedented innovation. It lay in the alignment of discipline, environment, and purpose. The slow pace that had once invited ridicule became the mechanism through which the vessel dissolved the coherence of a supply chain essential to the survival of distant fronts. The wrong design, dismissed by those who favored rapid solutions, became the template for a new understanding of how pressure could be applied across vast distances without requiring speed. The commander accepted that the significance of the patrol extended beyond his crew, beyond the steel hull that had carried them, and beyond the waters through which they now traveled. It touched the broader architecture of the war, revealing that conflicts shaped across continents could hinge upon the quiet decisions made inside a narrow control room where restraint outweighed impulse. He understood that the enemy's doctrine would eventually adapt, but adaptation would come too late for the positions already abandoned, the resources already lost, and the confidence already fractured. The lifeline that once bound distant garrisons to the heart of the empire now existed only as a memory fragmented by the slow, yet decisive passage of a vessel no one expected to succeed. As the submarine continued its journey through the calm, the crew sensed that their role in this transformation had reached its natural conclusion. They moved through their routines with a steadiness that reflected both fatigue and purpose. They understood that the patrol would be remembered not for dramatic confrontations, but for the structural consequences it left behind. Their success existed within the spaces that war often overlooked, the space where silence replaced motion, where patience outmaneuvered haste, and where the collapse of a single artery shifted the weight of an entire conflict. The ocean widened ahead of the vessel as if acknowledging the end of a passage marked by pressure, endurance, and the quiet dissolution of certainty. The commander watched the faint line of the horizon where water blended with sky, recognizing that their journey would not be celebrated with triumph or ceremony. Its legacy would unfold across distant regions, where commanders struggled to understand why their supplies had dwindled, why their positions had become untenable, and why their strategies no longer aligned with the world they believed they controlled. This understanding, shaped by silence, sustained by patience, and carried forward by the steady rhythm of a machine once dismissed as inadequate, became the final measure of the patrol's impact. And so the submarine advanced into the open water, its engines maintaining the quiet pulse that had defined its identity. Behind it lay an ocean altered by the collapse of an empire's final lifeline. Ahead lay the long passage home, and within the steady motion of steel and purpose lived the enduring truth that even the slowest vessel, when guided by discipline and a refusal to bow to expectation, could reshape the course of history through a silence stronger than force, carrying forward the weight of a war transformed by the quiet precision of its deliberate path.